שלום לכולם, אנחנו מבקשים להתחיל. המציגה הבאה תהיה פרופסור פרנסיס גרדנר, ויש לה מצגת רצינית ועמוסה, והיא רוצה להקפיד לעמוד בלוח הזמנים שלה. אני מאוד אבקש לתת לה את ההזדמנות להציג. Only good things.
Good. I hope Rami was saying good things. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay. Just by way of a very brief thank you, I'd like to say how completely thrilled I am to be here in this very beautiful and very interesting place with extraordinary hospitality. So thank you to everybody. Please tell me if you can't hear me or we have any translation subtleties, because that was great when people interrupted for both those reasons. That was really good. Rami says that I have to point out that the pictures aren't working very well at the bottom, and he said that I had to say that this is a picture of Jerusalem at the bottom. Don't know if you can see if that's true or not. It might be. Rami also says that I've tried to say far too much in my presentation, so I apologize for that, and I hope that I can talk to people properly later on, because there's so much to learn from Israel, and it's a very different situation. But I think one of the reasons why I feel there's so much to say is that we've been extremely busy in Britain with parenting interventions, and it's been quite a journey. We've decided that we were going to import programs from the US and from Australia, and the government's very recently started to spend an awful lot of money on this, on training the whole workforce and disseminating programs in a very widespread way. But it's been an incredibly long and rocky journey. There were storms of protest about even the idea of having American programs. Why would we want those American programs? We were laughed at sometimes. We don't talk to our kids like they do. We don't want to be like that. So why would we want American parenting programs? It's completely ridiculous. That's been quite a journey, but I think all that debate has been very useful as a learning process. But also, the other important part of the process, of course, was trying these things out in our own context and collecting our own data about their effectiveness. And I think now that most of the storm of protest and intense negative debate, anyway, has died down. And I think the reasons for that were that practitioners and parents really liked the programs in the main. They found them empowering for both parties. Many of the programs, and we've particularly been using Incredible Years and Triple P, which some of you will know, many of the programs proved to be very flexible for different cultures within the UK. And obviously we have a lot of new immigrants. What do we do? How do we talk to people from Somalia or Afghanistan, which are very big groups in some of our cities? Also, I think people came around to the idea that evidence did matter, especially once we collected our own, but then we found it looked the same as it did in America, that evidence. So that was sort of quite hard to take, but became convincing, I think, in the end. But also we found that the cultural differences between us and America, and of course the Triple P program is Australian, those cultural differences sparked thought and learning and discussion, both between us and American programs, but also between the different cultural groups within our country as well. And I think, as Professor Rosenfeld said, that's not about preaching then, that's about learning from discussion and from thinking. So that's all I want to say. So that'll be very good for Rami's timekeeping. So if I only had 3 minutes, I'd say that. But now here's the boring evidence, okay? Now I'm going to talk about parenting interventions in general, but to also think hard about how we can apply these or not to children who are being physically maltreated. And I'm going to focus particularly on the age range from sort of 2 to 12, that's because that's where most of the evidence is that I know. Now we can think about parenting interventions as being applicable to child maltreatment on 3 levels. First of all, the first level is that we can try to improve parenting skills across the whole population. So that's going to include people who are at high risk and at low risk. Then the second level, we talk about indicated prevention, so improving parenting in families who are identified as being at risk in some way. And thirdly, secondary prevention, and that's what we might refer to as treatment for families who are already maltreating their kids, but we want to prevent it happening again. So I'm going to talk about what kinds of interventions there are, what kind of evidence there is for their effectiveness, can they be applied to preventing physical abuse, and how well do parenting interventions transport and adapt across cultures and countries, and into hard-pressed and very diverse service patterns that we have between and within countries. And I'm going to use some examples from our trials of implementing these interventions in real-world settings in England and Wales. So why parenting intervention is important? This is pretty obvious to all of you, I'm sure, but it's helpful sometimes to rehearse these points. Parenting skill is... parenting skill is one of the strongest predictors of child maltreatment and child problem behaviour. It's also predictive of other outcomes that we'd like to prevent for kids, such as school failure, drug use, poor mental health. But above all, perhaps, we know a great deal about how to help parents to parent more effectively, and much evidence about this. So what do evidence-based parenting interventions look like? Well, the essential components of effective programs include, first of all, the specific factors. So those are the factors that relate to your theory of change about the particular program you're doing, which might have a cognitive behavioral underpinning or an attachment theory or whatever. Secondly, general factors, and these are things that effective practitioners do across all kinds of interventions. So they work in a way that's compatible with clients' beliefs and values. They encourage clients to focus on present and future possibilities rather than dwelling on the past. And they're empathic, accepting, and warm. And effective programs in the parenting field typically share both these general and specific principles. And we're talking about programs such as Triple P, The Incredible Years, parent management training from Oregon, and parent-child interaction therapy. So what are these specific components when it comes to parenting interventions? Well, they tend to emphasize principles rather than prescribed techniques. And I think this point is absolutely key. Because programs are often criticized for being a kind of cookbook technique, but it's not what it looks like if you look at something like the Incredible Years program. And it's this flexibility and lack of prescriptiveness that I think can make these programs very culturally flexible. But obviously that depends on the clinical skills of the person delivering the program, as well as on the program itself, and that's absolutely crucial. They focus on active problem solving by parents around their own family needs and goals, and that's the starting point, again, as we've heard before. And they use social learning principles that are well known, the importance of taking small steps, the importance of how parenting influences children's behaviour and vice versa, clarity and consistency and so on in dealing with kids. Raise my voice, okay, right. They also focus on relationship building between parent and child, on reducing conflict and finding alternatives to physical techniques of discipline. And they work on the principle of applying these principles to your own situation, using discussion, modelling, problem solving, practice, and so on. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Incredible Years program, which I believe there's been some work on this in Israel. Perhaps people can tell me more about it later. There's a parent, teacher, and a child-based version of the program, but I'm going to only be talking about the parent version. It has a strong evidence base both in clinical treatment settings and in preventive programs in more general populations at high-risk settings. There's quite a lot of evidence for its transportability across countries and cultures, and it's been adopted by a number of governments as an effective program and implemented. It consists of 12 to 14 two-hour group sessions every week, with the emphasis on shared problem solving and a collaborative style in the leader. Again, the starting point is what the parents want for their family and for their parent-child relationships. And there's discussion and role play and use of these much-hated American video clips, which English people don't always like, but it sparks discussion, and then they see the value of them in that. Just to show you a little bit about the content of the program, I think I could summarize this slide, which you'll be able to get from the website and things later, is that at the bottom level, we want to improve parent-child relationships, so it's improving positive parenting. And as we move up, which is to do with dealing with problem behavior and how to exercise controlling over kids in a way that's reasonable, then we want to use much less of that at the top of the pyramid. And we don't want to deal with kids' problem behavior unless we've built a context of a warm, empathic and positive relationship in the first place. So how do we know that parenting interventions work? Aaron's already talked about randomized controlled trials. They're often seen as a gold standard for minimizing bias. They've been used a lot in quite complex and community and system level interventions as well as in clinical ones. Parents' views are pretty central to the evaluation in this kind of field. People often complain that randomized controlled trials are too expensive, and they are expensive, but they're not nearly as expensive as widely disseminated, ineffective or untested practice, which is one possible alternative to tested interventions. So I wouldn't see them as necessarily expensive for that reason. And then, of course, as Aaron mentioned, there's also the possibility of wasting people's time and money, and worse, possibly doing harm. And there are examples of social interventions that have been shown to do harm. So what's the evidence base about effective parenting interventions? There's been over 100 randomized controlled trials showing that structured programs can work for reducing child problem behavior, improving parenting skill and confidence, and parent mental health. And a much smaller number of trials have shown that these programs can reduce maltreatment. And it looks as if the same kind of programs work for what you might call the ordinary changes in parenting, as work at the more hard end. So that's Incredible Years, parent-child interaction therapy, and Triple P. There's some similar findings from systematic reviews about programs that are more suited to teenagers as well, and many good systematic reviews. So much evidence that one might ask, why would you use interventions without an evidence base? This was an unpopular thing to say in England a few years ago, but I think that's changed a little bit. Now, in what service contexts have these parenting interventions been tested in randomized trials? They've ranged from universal programs to targeted prevention to treatment. There's been a range of settings in health services, in education, in nurseries, in child protective services, in the workplace, and so on. A range of delivery methods to individuals in the home, to groups of parents, via the telephone, using primary care staff, and using media-based mechanisms such as the TV and videos. So clearly they can be flexible, potentially, according to family needs and preferences in the context and the service context. And these are just the settings for the trials. Obviously, the range of settings that they're used in practice is wider still. Now, what kinds of families do these structured programs help? Well, they seem to be helpful for very low-income families as well as more average families. Also families with complex and multiple needs, such as maternal mental health problems, child abuse issues, and high poverty. But obviously it's very important that the interventions remove the barriers to engage, the practical and other barriers to engagement for these families. And quite a range of children have been helped by these programs, including those with severe conduct disorders, children with no problems at all, but where the problem is more in the family situation, and so on. Now, I've been involved in there's been about 6 randomized trials of American and Australian programs such as Incredible Years and Triple P in Britain. And I've been involved in 2 of those ones for Incredible Years. Obviously, to bring in these programs, people had to be trained, and we had to pay attention to fidelity to the model, so were people actually doing the program right? And we also had to think about adaptation to our local family and contextual needs. In Oxford, we did a trial in the voluntary sector, that means a not-for-profit organisation that was dedicated to seeing kids referred for quite severe behavioural and family problems in community settings. So we did the first trial there, and the second trial was in a more tricky setting, which was in multiple Sure Start services. These are services run for preschool kids in very low-income areas, and this part of North Wales is one of the poorest areas of the EU, or was, I think, until we gained a lot more countries anyway. And that was, the intervention was disseminated in multiple agencies in multiple areas within North Wales. And then we did a randomised controlled trial within that complex setting. What did the interventions need to do to overcome any barriers to engagement? Well, we used local community venues, and obviously we needed to take into account the parents' views about what places were accessible and acceptable to them. It was important to build relationships with families and referrers and staff working with children in the communities. We provided food and childcare. We offered choices about the timing. We tried actively to recruit fathers, but we're not very good at that in our country. We did home assessment visits, which obviously is crucial for the group leaders to understand the cultural constraints and practical constraints on those families with respect to their parenting. The collaborative process itself, building on parents' strengths and wishes and their individual goals, helps with engagement. Then other issues were that you could use phone calls between the sessions to engage families who are perhaps finding their needs not met sufficiently. And then we had to think about bilinguality. We solved that by offering separate groups in Wales because there was only 2 languages. That didn't work in Seattle. There were far too many languages. And so they've gone for using community interpreters in groups, which is fascinating. You can watch some of Webster Stratton's groups in Seattle with interpreters on some video materials on her website, which are very nice. And I'll make sure there's a reference to that for people. Okay, the first trial was the one in the not-for-profit organisation, seeing these high-end kids and families with quite severe behavioural and parent-child interaction problems. This randomised trial involved 76 families who were randomised to the intervention versus a waiting list group. So they had to wait 6 months for the intervention, which was a typical waiting time for many of the families anyway. The children were aged between 2 to 9. We used the Incredible Years parenting groups. And in short, the results showed very clear intervention effects on child problem behaviour, on both harsh and positive parenting skill. So relationships were being improved, but also parents decreased their use of yelling and hitting. And importantly, we got these results both in the views of the parents about what had happened as a result of the intervention, but also through our own independent observers going into the home and seeing what actually happened. They're quite strong effect sizes. The effects appeared to be maintained at 18-month follow-up, and we had high consumer satisfaction. And this was in a real-world service. These were real therapists being trialled, doing their normal job, which was brave of them to do that. And then the second trial was in a much more tricky and messy, if you like, real-world situation, because the groups were run in 11 low-income Sure Start areas, and almost each area was run by a different agency. So they were very complex. Organisationally, they're complex. But Judy Hutchins, who led this trial, was very good at raising enthusiasm for the programme, and she was doing a lot of training anyway, so she said, well, why don't we do a trial? And got the different agencies on board with that. So there were 133 families. These were younger children, aged 3 to 5. They lived in very low-income areas, and they were screened by regular services to look for signs of early behaviour problems. So it wasn't just offered to everybody, this programme. We got even stronger effect sizes in this one, on child problem behaviour, positive and negative parenting skill, again by both parent report and direct observation in the home. In this trial, we also had effects on parent depression, and the effects appeared to be maintained for 1 year. So to my mind, this is one of the first, I think, true effectiveness trials of one of these interventions in very messy and diverse real-world settings. So we were very pleased with the results. I thought that perhaps this would be the limit of the transportability of these interventions, but it seemed to work. Some other questions we were very interested in in both these trials was to ask for whom do these interventions work? Because obviously when you get a good effect size, not every family is helped. And is it that we were helping the better off families more than the others? Does it depend on ethnicity and so on? Well, our analyses, all these are published papers which I'll put on the website. Our analyses suggested that the intervention was working equally well, or in some cases better, with the most troubled parents. Better was that the more depressed parents did better with this intervention, which is quite surprising because you might think it would be much harder for those parents to engage. And it also worked better for the kids with the more severe behaviour problems. But if you looked at other factors like were you a single parent, did you have an extremely low income, were you a teenage parent, then those things made no difference to what you were equally likely to do well if you had those risk factors than if you didn't. And we also wanted to know about how and why did the intervention work. These analyses are known as mediators of change. And in both trials, the thing that stood out as predicting the amount that the child's behaviour changed was the amount that the parents' positive parenting skills changed. So did they praise and encourage and engage with the child more than they used to? The parents that changed most on that, the behaviour changed most. Okay, so what? So these parenting interventions seem to work to reduce harsh parenting, parent-child conflict, and child problem behaviour. So that logically sounds like that should help to prevent abuse. Sounds pretty plausible, doesn't it? But is there any evidence that they actually prevent abuse when we look at child maltreatment outcomes rather than just harsh parenting? And how relevant are these interventions to very high-end families with multiple difficulties? Going back to our levels of prevention and intervention, I'm going to give you one example of a trial at level 1, so population level prevention, trying to improve parenting right across the population, which is including low and medium risk groups as well as the higher end. And this example is where they implemented the PPP Australian programme very widely in child and family services right throughout 9 counties of South Carolina. And they did this by offering an enormous amount of training, by advertising that very well to agencies and offering it, for free. Well, I think the Centers for Disease Control paid for the training, but also a media campaign to encourage parents and professionals to think more about parenting, to get useful messages about parenting, and to hear about the program. Now, I must say that, again, my skepticism thought this is the limit of how could you change maltreatment across a whole population by doing that, because that's what they set out to do. Their aim was to reduce county-level maltreatment reports by doing this intervention in the whole population of children between 0 and 8. So what they did was to implement the program in 9 counties in a cluster randomized control design, where 9 counties were randomized to PPP and 9 counties got services as usual. The child abuse indicators were collected again after 2 years of implementing the program, and counties were not self-selected. I think the whole state decided to do this. So what did they find? Well, they had 3 measures of child maltreatment. One was substantiated child maltreatment reports, one was child out-of-home placements, and the other was recorded child maltreatment injuries. And on all 3 of those measures, they found a significant difference between the intervention group and the control group. So, for instance, child maltreatment injuries reduced in the Triple P counties, but increased in the control counties. So these are quite surprising, really, and impressive results for disseminating a program around services. Methodologically, I think the study appears to be fairly strong. The counties were fairly well matched at the outset as well as randomized. They increased public awareness of the program as well as changing, which would be an important mechanism for making this work, as well as changing child abuse rates. So that's potentially evidence that we could change parenting at a population level, and that would in turn change child maltreatment rates. There's a number of studies at level 2. I think Professor Dubovitz is going to talk about some of these, and I'll provide some papers on those as well. And then at the third level, secondary prevention or treatment to prevent re-abuse in parents known to Child Protective Services. I'm going to look at briefly at an example of adapting a parenting intervention to Child Protective Services based on the Incredible Years. And there's a very nice paper about how Webster Stratton has done that, which will be on the website, and the link to it is there. I'm also going to mention a systematic review we've done to try and gather evidence from all countries, although I think it was all from the States in the end, about the effects of parenting interventions on child maltreatment at the in Child Protective Services. First of all, what is the Webster Stratton program, Incredible Years parenting program? Is it applicable to parents who in the child protection system? Well, she had the idea of reanalyzing the data from 650 odd families who were in Head Start programs, who'd been through the Incredible Years parenting program, to see if those families were helped as much or less than the families that hadn't been in Child Protective Services. So in this reanalysis, she found that 20% of the kids that had been through these trialed programs the families had been in Child Protective Services. Not surprisingly, the problems that these families had were worse. The parenting skills and child behaviour problems were worse. However, their analyses showed that the intervention was just as effective for these families. So there was just as much improvement in parenting and problem behaviour. So that's quite interesting data. But since then, Webster Stratton has been using the programme in Child Protective Services directly. 2 minutes, right, okay. And she writes very nicely about how the programme is adaptable to these very needy families. For instance, spending longer on building basic relationships, on parent attributions and anger, putting more focus on appropriate developmental expectations for the child, and on dealing with hitting and physical punishment. What about our systematic review? Altogether, we did 3 systematic reviews of intervention for children who've already been maltreated. We looked at parenting, at family therapy, and at child-focused interventions. And I'm just going to focus on the parenting one. We found 7 randomized controlled trials of parenting interventions for children who've already been maltreated. And most of those were compared to treatment as usual, which means whatever services were already offered in Child Protective Services, which maybe differ quite a lot from place to place. Anyway, the studies were not of particularly good quality. They were small. Only a few of them had maltreatment outcomes. The one that did, which was of parent-child interaction therapy, did show some evidence for reducing maltreatment as well as improving parenting and reducing harsh parenting. And so the evidence was stronger that these programs improved parenting skills within this very hard-end group. And most of the trials were not large enough or not well set up enough to measure actual maltreatment outcomes. So I would say perhaps it's promising at that end rather than entirely convincing yet. I think that just repeats my conclusions. I've just about 1 minute, that's fine. Okay, and finally, and I know that Knut is going to talk more about this after lunch. To what extent can parenting interventions translate well to other countries and cultures? Now, these programs developed in Australia and the US have been used and tested in many countries, and there have been randomized trials, for instance, in Ireland, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Norway, New Zealand, and implemented in many more countries. And I mentioned the misgivings we had in the UK, but I think that those have become less over time. And what about cultural rather than... This is literally 20 seconds. What about cultural diversity? Obviously, there's a lot of cultural diversity in many parts of the US and the UK where these programs have been used. And a very large study of the Incredible Years found no differences in outcomes for children, parents' engagement, attendance, or parent satisfaction by ethnic group in a United States setting. So I think those kind of results are very promising. And then my concluding slide. What do we know? So there's a very strong evidence base for parenting interventions changing child and parent behaviour, including reducing harsh parenting. And there's quite a lot of evidence for these programs being transferable across real-world settings and cultures and families, particularly because of their flexibility. And they appear to be able to help quite marginalised and low-income families. Do they actually prevent child abuse? I would say from this evidence, probably. I find the study from South Carolina quite convincing and interesting, but needs replicating, but also promising evidence for the hard-end families as well. Thank you.